Good morning, and a continued good Yontif, 20th of Kislev, continuing from the 19th of Kislev. And we are on volume 3 of Ayin Beis, page 1269. So yesterday, I reviewed and elaborated a little more on the Reshimu and the Kav. These two, you can say, primordial forces at the beginning of Ishtalshlus, which would become the root of the containers and the root of the energies, post-Tzimtzum. So earlier we learned that pre-Tzimtzum, you have the root of the containers is deeper than the root of the Oir, in the sense that one is coming from what he called Ein Sof, and the one is from Atzmus Muhus Ein Sof. But now he's discussing it more on the, let's call it the operational level. And briefly, that the Reshimu encompasses and gives us an impression, it has, like I called it, a silent witness of all the energy that exists pre-Tzimtzum, which was concealed. But the Reshimu keeps it intact in a concealed way. The Kav, on the other hand, because it's a Gilui, its whole purpose is revelation. Revelation has to be guided and directed and regulated. So there's the part of the Eilal Kolona that's completely concealed, and then the part of the 10 spheres, the 10 hidden spheres, in a diminished form that begin to emerge in the Kav. And definitely the Pnimius at Oir. All that is still Chetzenius Oir. There's the Pnimius of the Chetzenius and the Chetzenius of the Chetzenius. Then there's the Pnimius, which is the inner intention, like I gave the example of the artist, or in this case of the creator, that transcends, it precedes even the 10 hidden spheres. It's called Koydem Alei Saratzen. So that is definitely not the Kav, but the Reshimu, as he said, these words, Hakol hu b'Reshimu b'chinas muhuz v'atzmus ha'oir. Okay. In the parentheses that we learned yesterday, he went a little further and he said, what about the fact that the Kav, Chazer v'heir, the Kav also is bringing back and returning the energy from Pre-Tzimtzum? So he explained that nevertheless, it now comes in a form of Hagbola and Metzias, with a certain confined, a certain parameter and substance. Which means the teacher, even the energy, even the intelligence that he, for himself, not for the student, also has to be concealed when the Kav, when he's transmitting to the student. As he said, when he's conveying it to the student, it doesn't have the Ribuy Ha'oir and Pshitus the way it is before the Tzimtzum. However, that's when we look from the perspective of the recipients of the world. But the Pnimius on its own, not as it's seen through the eyes of how the teacher is communicating to the student, so therefore the Reshimu is containing the impression as it is, not as the teacher applies himself to the student. And on the other hand, the Kav is as it's applied to the student, and therefore it doesn't have that level of pshitus, of seamlessness and shapelessness, as we discussed at length yesterday in the class before, and the class the day before. So that's the parentheses. So Reshimu b'chinas ribuy apshitus mamish k'mashu be'etzem mahusay. However, now he continues after the parentheses, the line that begins Ribuy Ha'oir on page 1269, 5 lines from before the end of the paragraph. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So now he goes, Rak sheba Reshimu. However, this is a critical qualification. However, even though the Reshimu does have within it that testimony, if you wish, or that impression, not in a revealed way, as he's going to say now, of everything that was there before the Tzimtzum, and he says everything, the 10 hidden spheres as they are in their full intensity, the Eir El Al Kolona, the synergy that's more than the sum of the parts, and the Pnimius that's even higher than that. The Pnimius as it is in the Creator's intentions before it even gets revealed. In any way, he says, all of this, but the Reshim, it's all concealed, the Eir. It's true, it contains it all, but as we said, latent state, a dormant state, it's not in a revealed way. The Eir has been concealed. So it's not like we're talking about that Reshimu is a pre-Tzimtzum light. Before the Tzimtzum, everything was radiating. All that we just said was the only thing that dominated. And complete conscious and complete revelation, consciousness, awareness. The Tzimtzum concealed it all. The Reshimu contains so-called the messages from there. But it's, like he says, Nisalim Ha'er, Keneda, as it's known, the Nekudas Reshimu, he bechinas Helam. With everything we've said, the Nekudas Reshimu, which is this concentrated point that carries all that's there before, is in a state of concealment. It's not Oir. Ubavade. Okay, then he continues. Ubavade, and certainly, Al Yedei Helam, Bo B'chinas Mitzias. And because of the Helam, it definitely becomes some form of Mitzias. What does he mean by that? He means it's not completely subjugated, like bottle, as it is Lifnei HaTzimtzum, as he's going to say now. Ukiyadua HaKlal, as the axiom or the rule, the principle, it's the best word. It's known the principle, the Helam Ha'er Gerim Inyan HaMitzias. When Eir is concealed, it causes something to begin to have an identity. I'm going to explain that in a moment. In other words, it's not just that it reveals that which was maybe concealed before, but also in the very Eir itself, the concealment of the Eir causes the Eir to begin to have some form of substance. I'll explain. Let me just finish the entire piece. Nevertheless, in this Reshimu, though it's concealed and therefore became a Metzias, in it, in a concealed state, it has all that energy. As it is in its core level, but it's there in a state of concealment. The Helam Ha'er, and this Helam Ha'er he's adding now is through this Nekudas Reshimu. That's where it gets all concentrated and concealed, but not through the Tzimtzum. In other words, what he's adding here, the Tzimtzum did not affect the Reshimu directly. The Reshimu itself is a state of Helam. And because of a state of Helam, you don't see all these revelations. But it's not because the Tzimtzum concealed it. Like we said yesterday, the very letters or the very Koyach HaGvul is still divine. It's just the divine as it manifests in concealed state. So the Reshimu is not just that the Eir has been concealed from those letters of the Reshimu. The Reshimu itself is a state of concealment. It's the Koyach HaHelam of Elikus. But it's a power of God, the power to conceal. But within it lies everything that was there before. That's why it's called the Reshimu, as he explained. Let me explain this in more detail, and because it can be a little confusing what I just said. Because most people would say, 1 minute, before the Tzimtzum, everything was shining. The letters were even invisible because all you had was Eir. Eir HaBligvul, Eir HaGvul, everything was there in an infinite mass, like we said, a seamless quilt, a seamless field of energy. Yes, within it, God already began to envision existence. So you have the 10 hidden spheres, you have the Eir El Kolona, you have the Pnimius Eir. But what dominates is complete divine consciousness, period. The Tzimtzum conceals that. We know already what impact it had on the Kav, because the Kav follows, and it's just a very narrow stream in order for the student to be able to receive. So clearly the Kav is impacted by the Tzimtzum in several ways, as we learned. It conceals the synergetic energy and diminishes the very energy of the 10 hidden spheres. But what about the Reshimu? Does the Tzimtzum have an effect on the Reshimu? So we're going to learn soon that it does not. But that doesn't mean that the Reshimu is a revelation. Because remember, the Reshimu, its root, is the power of Helam and the power of Gvul before the Tzimtzum. The only thing is the power of Gvul and Helam is completely invisible in the face of the all-encompassing divine light. So it's like saying within God's power of infinite light, also he has the power to conceal, but it's only a power there. Once he conceals the infinite light, and that has direct impact on the Kav, the Reshimu suddenly emerges. Because what happens when you remove, like I said, the water recedes, then what remains is the Koyach HaGvul, but it was not touched. All it was, it now emerges. But it doesn't emerge as a reveal state because it's fundamentally not a revelation. So it's not that the Tzimtzum created the Reshimu. The initial thinking was that there's Oyer, you so to speak, the Oyer recedes and the trace remains. It's like writing words and then you erase it. No, here is that nothing is erased. The Reshimu just was not visible at all, or you could say it was not active at all. Now, after the Tzimtzum, the Reshimus can become active even though it's in a concealed state because it's fundamentally of the power to conceal. And as I mentioned a few times, you can't conceal concealment. You can conceal light. By concealing light, the concealment reveals, the power of concealment is revealed. It won't be obvious to us until the Kav interacts with the Reshimu and the Kalim come alive. But right now you have a power that is essentially a silent witness to everything and contains everything that existed before the Tzimtzum. Well, everything, the levels he spoke about, but it's there. So, and let's say using the example of the artist, when he's making the art, just like the teacher, when he's teaching this child, the student, all you see are the details of the art. Yes, within it lies a lot more. But right now, all that's relevant is creating Chachma, Bina, this piece of the art, this piece. The artist obviously knows his bigger vision, but it's concealed at this point. Because as he's speaking to the student, he has to focus on the details that the student understands. The teacher can't be focusing on his bigger picture. He has to focus about the small picture, the details. So it's there, but it's concealed. That's why the Kav is not privy to it, because the Kav is the paintbrush. The teacher, as he's involved with the student. But in the teacher, it exists. So is there anywhere after the Tzimtzum that you can say is like a storage house, if you wish, that is storing the teacher's or the artist's bigger picture, the synergy, or even deeper, the Pnimius Ha'er? So if there was no Reshimu, you'd say, all we have is the paintbrush and the details. Can a student from the art come to discover the synergy? Yes, of course you can. But it's going to be limited. He'll never really see it from the perspective of the artist or the teacher. It'll be mamata l'mayla. I studied the art, and from the art, I discovered certain deeper truths about God. But if you really want to know elements of God that can only be revealed by God himself, the Reshimu is where it comes into play, because the Reshimu stores all that DNA, so to speak, pre-Tzimtzum DNA. It is concealed, but it's there at least post-Tzimtzum. So now, when the Oyer begins to do its work and the student starts learning Ayin Beis, and from the details grows to the bigger picture, you have a Reshimu to access. Like I mentioned yesterday, it's like the prodigy. It's latent, but it's there. It's not non-existent. So the Reshimu plays that role that is essentially like storing it until the day when we can access it. Like I mentioned yesterday, we're taught the entire Torah in our mother's womb. Then we're made to forget. So what's the point? Because we're only made to forget consciously. It's in a latent state. It's like a Reshimu. It's sitting there in our superconscious. When you start learning Torah and getting it and say, now I understand. Then the Reshimu starts playing a role, because behind the scenes, you have everything you need in your subconscious, everything you need in the Torah. You just don't know about it yet. So the Reshimu plays that type of invisible role. Now, one more thing I want to say before then I'll stop for questions. What does he mean by saying that Helam causes Mitzias, and even the Eir. So the general rule is like this. The more intense energy, the less container there is. What do I mean by container? The less substance there is. The more the energy gets concealed, the more the substance of the entity becomes revealed. So if you think, for example, we talk about one cell. Upon conception, a child has been conceived, but it's one cell, a tiny, minuscule cell. You can't see any details, but in it, concentrated, is everything that will come to life later. So the keli is negligible. It's almost nothing there. But the Eir is extremely intense. As soon as the Eir gets weaker, the keli can expand and grow. So keli in this context is expression, is what he calls substance, metzias. When the divine energy is completely intense, we are then completely absorbed by it. You don't have a metzias for yourself. Let's say you're sitting before your teacher and you're completely absorbed in the teacher's brilliance. There's no metzias. It says sometimes in Chassidus that the student can't find a metzias to himself. He has nowhere to put himself because he's completely overwhelmed by this gilui. So essentially your ego, your identity disappears for that time being. When the teacher stops teaching and the gilui becomes weaker, what happens? The metzias begins to emerge. So metzias really means the substance of something, its definitions, its parameters. It's like I'm often explain when you read a book and you're completely absorbed, you don't even realize that you're reading letters. You're listening to music and you're so completely absorbed by it, you don't even realize you're listening to music. You become completely dissolved in the experience. So the metzias of the entity is in direct proportion to how much the gilui is. The stronger the gilui, the less metzias there'll be. The less the gilui is more concealed, that's metzias. So he's saying that because that Tzimtzum did conceal the whole Eir HaBligvul, so now that the Reshimu becomes so-called, has some substance. It's a concealed substance. So before the Tzimtzum, everything was all absorbed and dissolved in the Eir Ein Sof. After the Tzimtzum, he says, Reshimu Nisalama Eir, Abavada, they hold them, you have a Metzias. Now that's why you can call it Reshimu. Lifnei Tzimtzum, you can't call it Reshimu. And then he adds that this is not just that the energy itself, once it recedes, then it leaves room for Metzias, that the Eir itself, greater Metzias Eir, because Eir too can be the two levels. So I'll use the example from Shai Yichud V'Amunah. The Alter Rebbe says that if there's sunlight outside of the sun, you have to say there's sunlight inside the sun. If there's heat coming from, let's say, a fire, there's definitely heat within the fire. Because the heat can extend, let's say, a few feet, or with the sun, the light shines hundreds of thousands of miles. So for sure, there's more intense light. But in the sun, because it's so much part of the source, the light is completely insignificant. As we said, like Shraga B'tira, Mayahana. A candle in the light of the sun has no significance. And the contrary, it's even dark. It darkens the area, as Chassidus brings. If the sun is concealed by night, when the sun sets, then the candle is in full glory. It's very significant. So in other words, even Eir itself has a metzias of Eir. That metzias of Eir, its substance as an entity of its own, is really only emerges when the real intensity of the light is concealed. So it's not just that it leaves room for kalim when it's concealed. The Eir itself becomes more substantial. You can talk about sunlight outside of the sun. Inside the sun, the sunlight is completely nullified and even more powerful than the light outside the sun. Just like you say, the warmth within the fire, that's a given because the fire is this very source of warmth. We talk about warmth, that the fire is warming me because I'm outside of the fire. In the fire, the warmth is a completely nullified compared to the very source of warmth. So that's what he's saying here, that the Tzimtzum, Helam, allows Metzias to emerge, both Metzias of, like I said, of Reshimu, and also even the Oyer itself, he says, then now you could talk about an existing light. The light, for example, inside the teacher, before he starts teaching, there's a light there too, but the light is so absorbed and so much part of his brilliance, it doesn't have any impact. When he conceals his brilliance, then the light becomes a mitzias, and the student can say, here is Aleph, Beis, Gimel. The light is beginning to have definition that the recipient can relate to. So this last piece. After explaining that Reshimu contains it all, he explains it's all in a state of concealment, and therefore also something of substance is there, but it's latent. You can't talk about it in any revealed fashion, as I just explained. So it's a pretty powerful, comprehensive view on a picture of what after the Tzimtzum, what is happening, what are the dynamics. Like I said, like upon birth, the entire Torah you forget, but it's there, it's sitting there. I mean, obviously it's not a perfect example because the Reshimu does not forget, but from a point of view of the child, we don't have any access to it. It's not revealed to us. And then the Kav is the active force that actually brings revelation into the picture again. And when it interacts with the Reshimu, as we'll learn, you have the complete formation of Eris and Kalim, and they communicate with each other until the structure of a child develops not from one cell, and it becomes a full-bodied entity and creation. So that's so far what he said about Reshimu and Kav, which is coming to explain ultimately that the root of the container is higher than the root of the Eir, but he's not finished yet. The next paragraph continues the discussion. But I'll stop in case anybody wants any clarification. Okay. Now he says like this. Yehine Yedua, new paragraph on page 1269. He's going to dissect the Reshimu a little more now. And maybe one of the reasons is because if you learn about the Reshimu elsewhere, in previous Maimarim, you'll find that the Reshimu also has other aspects to it. This is one aspect, that the Reshimu is like a snapshot of everything pre-Tzimtzum in a concealed form. But he says it's Dini Yadua because now it's known. The Reshimu yesh ba beis inyanim. The Reshimu has in it two things, two components, two elements. Etzem nekudas Reshimu, the very nekuda of the Reshimu, va'ir ein sof sheba. And the second thing is the Eir Ein Sof that's within it in a concealed form, but it's in it. It's almost like saying the seed and what's within the seed. Now, to say the Reshimu is a seed is an example, but it works because the Reshimu is, like we said on the Kuda, that something remained after the Tzimtzum in a concealed state. So I'm just using seed or the cell, one cell, and that which is what is within it. So there's the Eir Ein Sof within the Reshimu, and there's the Nekuda Reshimu itself. Now, in the classes I gave about Reshimu, I elaborated on this more. How this idea itself, the Rebbe Rashab, evolves in the Rebbe Rashab's Maimarim. If you go back, for example, to the early Maimarim of the Rebbe Rashab in, say, in 1880, in Tafresh Mem Gimel, Mem Daled, or even later, he speaks about this as b'derech efsher, that maybe you can say there's two things in the Reshimu. Here now he speaks about it as a given fact. And this all is part of the evolution of the understanding of Reshimu prior to the Rebbe Rashab, the Rabbi Marash, the Tzemach Tzedek, all the way back to the Alter Rebbe, and really all the way back to the Arizal of how we understand Reshimu. I'm not going to go into all of that because, firstly, I did a few classes on that in the Kollel. You could listen to them. They were posted here. And secondly, the key focus is what he wants to say here. So let's keep to Beis Inyanim. So again, Etzem Nekudas Reshimu, va'er Ein Sof Sheba. And I was going to explain these two elements. I believe the first one is discussed all the way to the bottom of the page. Okay, no, we'll see. Let's see how it goes here. Okay. So let's start with the Etzem Nekuda Sarashim. The very Nekuda. Now, it's called a Nekuda, even though you could say, 1 second, there's nothing there. But remember, we learned about Nekuda, like a dot. Even in mathematics, when you make a dot, that's just because we need to make something that we can see. But conceptually, a dot doesn't occupy space. That's why you have infinite dots in a line. The first rule in geometry. Infinite dots in a line. How could there be infinite dots? If a dot is, let's even say it's a 0.1 millimeter, but it's still something. So how could there be infinite amounts of that in the line? So the answer is because in mathematics, a dot is a conceptual entity that does not occupy space. The truth is, this is reflective. When we say Yud Ke Vav Ke, we learned about the Yud. So the Yud in Chachma has some type of shape. It has a center, it has a top point, a low point, a Yud when you make it in a Sefer Torah. But a Yud in Chachma is just an expression, it's just a pure point. So you say, so the expression sometimes in Chassidus, it says, you can't say it's a yesh, you can't say it doesn't exist. So we basically say it's a state of ayin, but it's a state. So the Nekudas Reshimu should not be understood that you see there's some, 1 point, like 1 point of light, or 1 point of darkness for that matter. And so the reason we use Nekuda, because there's no other way of expressing how is this all concentrated. Because it's definitely not expansive, because the Reshimu is not expansion. Or expands. This latent state is there. So that's why I used the example seed, kernel. These are all examples. They're not perfect examples. So that's Nekudas Reshimu. And then there's what's within this Nekudas Reshimu. What does it contain? She says, Etzem Nekudas Reshimu, whatever remains in this Reshima, however you explain it, as we said before, was all there before the Tzimtzum. It's not a new creation. The Kav, by the way, is a new creation. Even though the oil of the Kav, so to speak, its root was there, but it was not in the form of a Kav, like we learned before. Like when the teacher is teaching Aleph Beis to a student, so even though the seichel of the Aleph Beis the teacher had before, but the actual process of teaching Aleph Beis Gimel so on is a new reality. It's coming from the Ur. Reshimu, on the other hand, as we learned, is not that way. Reshimu is not some new creation. Reshimu emerges after you conceal the Ur. So the Koyach HaGvul of the Eibishter emerges, which you would not see and would not be effective as long as it's all consumed within the Ur Ein Sof. So the Nekudas Reshimu was Kalula, encompassed in that Ur Ein Sof, Gam Kaidem Atzimtzum. And what is it? Exactly. The power of God creating finite. Now you won't see that when there's Eira Bligvul, Koyach HaBligvul, and everything is Bligvul, you don't see the Koyach HaGvul. You know it's there because God is not limited and he can create the finite. But when the Koyach HaGvul, Bligvul dominates, you don't see the Koyach HaGvul. Like, you ever hear stories, for example, you see, let's say, a brilliant teacher, a brilliant man, or brilliant woman for that matter. And you hear them teach, and you really see a Mayin HaMizgaber. It's like an overflowing fountain of wisdom. It flows and flows, endless. Remember, Fabrengens, the Rebbe, hours, like endless flow, to the point that if you don't know better, you could say this person doesn't even have the capacity to stop flowing. It's like a flowing. It's an infinite, relentless fountain of knowledge that doesn't stop flowing. And then suddenly, this same brilliant teacher stops. At kan akofa aleph. We did all the dancing, all the speaking, and now he's exercising restraint. He's exercising, limiting the flow. Now it's a chiddush because till now the fountain was just flowing. That he had the power to do so, we know, because he has the power. But until the bli gvul doesn't stop, you don't see the koyach hagvul. You don't see the power of restraint until it actually is active. In other words, as long as a person is not exercising restraint, even though he has the power of restraint, it's completely invisible and encompassed. So Ayin Beis is God, like an endless flow of energy. The Tzimtzum is God's power of restraint. So what emerges? The koyach hagvul. That's the Reshimu. That's why sometimes Tzimtzum and Reshimu go hand in hand, because it's actually the same power. It's the power to limit, the power to conceal. So that's the koyach hagvul shebein sof. So before the Tzimtzum, it was there, but completely not recognizable, completely not active, not just not recognizable like an object inside of water that you don't see. It completely doesn't have anything because it's all part of God's infinite powers. What happened next? When the Tzimtzum took place, again, conceptually, it's not in real time. This is all happening right now. Nisha Reshimu Ein Sof b'nekudas harashimu. Let me read the exact words and we'll translate. Shenisal ma'ir al yidei nekudas harashimu. So when there was the Tzimtzum, what did it do? It's like I just said. It shut down. God stopped speaking, so to speak. It's not speaking, but God stopped flowing. The flow receded. The air receded. The air habli gvul. So what happened? Nisha Reshimu Ein Sof b'nekudas harashimu. This nekudas harashimu now has within it that energy, but it's all in a state of concealment in this nekuda. So in other words, and the oil is concealed in this nekuda. Let me just, by contrast, it'll be easier to understand. If there was no Reshimu, what would happen is everything recedes, and that's it. You have a cholol u'makom poneh. You have an empty space, and there's nothing there. I mean, nothing. Atzmus is always there because Atzmus is not subject to tzimtzum. We're not talking about built-in mitzias nimtza of Atzmus. We're talking about from the point of view of mitzias nimtza. It's a complete void. But that's not what Eibishter wanted. He wanted the koyach hagvul to remain. So the Reshimu remains, and it has within it a memory, as I said, more than a memory, a Roshem, I could say impression, or I said witness, however you explain it. I mean, whatever words you use, it has within it in a concealed form now, where before it was completely invisible, completely encompassed in the air habli gvul. Now this koyach hagvul is there in a latent form. So in other words, there's no revelation, but it's there. So the cholol, in the words of the Ramaz in Eitz Chaim, cholol lav dafka. That's what he says. When you say cholol u'makom poneh, a space, it's lav dafka. It doesn't mean actually complete nothing. I mean, sometimes it can give the example. This is not a good example, but it still can help understand. You talk about a black hole, so we know we can't see a black hole because the gravitational pull of the star is so intense, it doesn't even allow light to escape. But we know there's light, and there's tremendous amount of power. But from the point of view of the recipient, meaning us, it's a black hole. So it's the power of essentially gvul that's not allowing the light out. So it's just an example that you could have something that's completely not visible. So that's what he's calling the Kshayat Tzimtzum. There's a Roshem of the Ein Sof in this nekuda, but it's Nisalam ha'ayir ayidei nekudas harashimu. So it's not just Helam. There's something there that's completely concealed, but it's there. Okay. Now he's going to compare it to for contrast purposes. It'll help us understand. He says, "Ve'ein zeh k'moy havayas akeli ba'akudim." This is not like how a keli comes into being, is born, and is given birth to in Akudim. which happens through Amshachas Ha'er. I'll explain in a moment. The Isa Beitz Chaim, Shar Matul Moy Matei, Perek Aleph. I'll read, then I'll explain. So it says in Eitz Chaim the following. He talks about a Reshimu too. That when the air was transmitted, and then it was nostalgic, meaning first the air came, then Rotzi V'shuv, then the air was removed. Hiniach Reshem, it left an impression. And through the histalkus, the removal of the air and the distance of the light, this impression, this impression became thicker and with more substance, and it became a state of a keli. So he's now going to compare to understand the Reshimu that we're talking about after the Tzimtzum Arishan. He's going to compare, and Eitz Chaim talks about another Reshimu, which is much more like what we would relate to. And it goes like this. In the creation of existence, as I said before, for existence to be able to emerge, you have to be able to have a balance between Eris and Keli. If the intensity of the oil of the neshama was so powerful, as it is the moment of conception, you'd never have room for a fetus to develop. Too much oil does not allow for a keli to emerge. So you need the oil to diminish, and the keli could grow. You know, it's like trying to find an example for it. Look at anything. When you are a teacher of a student, and if you're completely all domineering, the student will never become independent. If parents don't let their children walk on their own and fall on their own, they'll never learn to walk. So there's a need to exercise a certain restraint. In other words, to conceal the oyer so the keli can develop itself. This is the real art of education and communication, where you're allowing someone, you're training them to stand on their own feet. So the process, the way Kabbalah Chassidus explain it, is that the oyer is very intense on the higher levels, but then how are the kelim going to emerge? So then what happens next is the oyer, like in a state of moti v'loy moti or rotzi v'shuv, the oyer shines, then it recedes and allows the keli to begin to emerge. But you need to shine, because you can't deprive the keli also of nourishment. You know, think of it like rainfall. To nurture the fields, you need rain. But if the rain came down like a flood, it would destroy the fields. So the rain has to come down in drops. It comes, it's absorbed, and then the next drop, and the next drop. So the process is that first you have very intense oyer, the divine oyer. I mean, to use another example, we work mamata lamayla. We already live in a world of eris and kelim. If you purchase a book or you're learning Ayin Beis, there's ideas conveyed in words as we're reading them. All the process of Tzimtzum has happened already when the Rebbe Rashab wrote Ayin Beis. But if you think about the process of creation, when the Rebbe Rashab took his brilliant ideas, when he was first all within himself, before he decided to Pre-Tzimtzum them into words and pages and to a Hemshech Ayin Beis, then Ur starts. You begin with Ur. The Keli is very negligible. The letters of thought are extremely subtle. But then you have to be Pre-Tzimtzum the Ur, so there be words that can emerge, sentences, phrases, paragraphs, chapters, maimorim, so it can be expressed. So this is a process. Now, we don't usually think about it that much because we, as I said, we start from the bottom up. But every process of creation goes through this. I'm talking about everything. Creation of a business plan, building a house, writing a book, composing music, everything. Begins first in a very amorphous place, a lot of oyer. The oyer then begins to become structured. So you can create an outline, you can create something that you can hold on to. So that's why you have the concept of Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim. So we've learned this, but let me explain. It's based on the Parsha Vayetze, the 3 types of sheep that Yaakov bred by Lavan. So it was Akudim, Akudim, and Vrudim. So in Eitz Chaim, he talks about them as 3 dimensions of the spiritual worlds. Akudim is Eser Eires Akud B'Klei Echad. Akud means bound. 10 energies in one container. Now that does not make for a viable life. If you have 10 energies in one container, you're not going to have a human being. Human being needs many containers: arms, legs, a brain, a heart, etc. So then comes step 2, Nikudim. Nikudim means separate energies, 10 energies and 10 containers. But they're still too intense for each other. That's why it's the world of Toyu. That's where the shattering of the containers happens. Then comes the Vrudim, is the world of Atzilus, or otherwise known as Tikkun. The Tikkun, and now you have 10 energies within 10 containers, but they're balanced. In Toyu, in Akudim, it's called very Eres Merubim and Kelim Mu'atim. Intense energies in very negligible containers. In Akudim, it's 10 energies in one container. That would be like the one cell upon conception. I know I used the example earlier on the Reshimu, but it fits here as well. The Akudim is 10 energies, but they're not yet balanced and in harmony with the 10 containers. The containers are still very fragile, and the energies are very intense. In a healthy human being, a balanced human being, the energies have become diminished. So now each one can enter their particular container, and you have a viable, functioning entity. In human terms, means a healthy body, a healthy soul within a healthy body. What would Toyu look like in a human being? It'd be a person who's not balanced, is not stable. A lot of energy. The containers are very weak. Akudim is a completely known entity. It's 10 energies in one container. It's like the moment of conception. So in Eitz Chaim, he discusses relatively at length the process. So I'm going to read it now again, and you'll see what he says. And then he's going to talk about the Reshimu that remains. So he says again like this: when the oir transmits, vinistalik, and then it has to recede to allow something to emerge, something to be developed, like the rain. So you need something to begin to take hold. Hiniach Roshem. The oir didn't completely remove. The oir was not completely removed. It left an impression. But because the oir now is not in its full intensity, it has receded. So through the istalkus aricha ka'ir, this Roshem, the impression it left, can begin to grow and develop and becomes a thicker or more substance. And from that will emerge the kelim. The Eitz Chaim is telling us how the kelim are developed. They're developed, you need oir because without oir, nothing is created. You need the energy. But you can't have the energy overwhelming. So the energy recedes. It leaves some residue, some impression. And that impression can now begin to get thicker and therefore then develop into a full keli. So basically it's through the oir that the kelim emerge, but the oir has to be somewhat take a back seat to allow the keli to emerge. So it's like going back to the example with the teacher or the parents. You want your child or you want the student to learn. So the teacher gives a certain spoon-fed idea, a short idea, whatever that idea may be. There's a letter called Aleph, and you pronounce it Aleph. Then what does the teacher do? The teacher withdraws a bit and wants the student to repeat it. Say Aleph. The student says Aleph. So there's a little oir that remains from what the teacher taught. But and with that oir, the student can begin to develop its own keli to understand what that word means. If the teacher would not withdraw, so to speak, and would be so dominant, the student would never learn Aleph. It would be the teacher constantly saying it. You need that restraint. On the other hand, if the teacher withdrew all the way, the student wouldn't have anything to work with. So you need oir. You need the oir to withdraw. You need it to leave some impression. and then the student can develop its own kelim around that. That's how the Eitz Chaim explains how kelim came to be. Now we will learn soon that the source of the kelim is not from the oir, but the way the keli actually is develops is through the oir. So what he's going to do now is compare and say, 1 second, here's a Roshem. Is the Reshimu after the Tzimtzum Rishon the same type of Roshem? He's going to say no, it's not. Because here the Roshem, you know what, let me not let's read it inside. So the Rebbe Rashab now is comparing the Roshem in Eitz Chaim about Akudim to the Reshimu that we're learning about the Tzimtzum. That is very different. So he says, Ein ze k'moi havoyas akli ba'akudim. The Reshimu of the Tzimtzum Rishon is not like the development and the emergence of the containers or the creation, the coming into being of the containers in Akudim, which comes through Hamshachas Ha'er that the Eitz Chaim just explained. The Ha'er transmits, it recedes, it leaves an impression, and the Keli develops as a result. So he says like this now. So again, Nasser Reshem, b'bchinis ivies. Ivies is av, from the word av, thickness. But Nasser b'chinis kli. Why? Because the kodim, the hamshachas ha'er, lo yoy b'chinis kli ba'akudim. Before there was a hamshach of air, there was no container altogether in akudim. Rak keshanim shecha oir. It's only after there was oir. Hiniach reshem. That left an impression, some trace, and from there the kelim began to develop. And what is the reshem in this case? By the akudim, not after the tzimtzum harishon. Harishim hu ha'iviyus shahoysa klula koydem ba'oir. What is the iviyus? Iviyus are like the particles, the thickness that was before encompassed in the oir. And when the intensity of the oir receded, this thickness began to emerge. By this, so what does he say here? Because of that, why is the Roshem not, when the oir recedes, why doesn't the Roshem also recede? No, just like the light leaves, also any residue should also leave. He says it doesn't. Like he says in chapter 3. Let me read on to understand. And when the air is removed, there becomes more thickness to this trace and impression.
Is it because it's no longer pure ore?
No, give me a moment. Give me a moment.
I don't think it was ever ore.
One example, like when you boil water, there's always going to be some residue that remains after you boil the water. If you empty the pot, you could sometimes find this residue. Now, where was it before? Before, it was completely absorbed in the water, and you weren't able to separate so-called that residue from the water. So there's processes that do this all the time. That even though initially it's one entity, this is true also with chaff and wheat and grain and other things where, like, you can have something that's not, you don't say it's 100% pure. It's 90%. It has additives or something in it. When you boil it or in some other way you separate it, you can have some of the particles that were there, that were absorbed, that were there earlier, and now they remain. What he's saying here is that the oir has in it a certain element of thickness that is like particles within the oir but it's not obvious. So the oil recedes, those particles remain. And as they are now so-called they're not under the so-called influence of the whole oil, they can emerge and develop into kelim. That's the obvious thing that he's saying here. What I'm not understanding is this next sentence where he says, again, right, there was no keli at all. It's only when the was transmitted, it left this residue, it left this impression. Okay. I'm not sure what he's adding with that. I understand what he wants to lead to, compare it to the Reshimu of the Tzimtzum Arishin. But that line, because of what? Because it was there before, or because it was not there before? I may have to look at Shiur Akudim. Okay, I gave it my thought. If somebody wants to comment on this, please do. Maybe someone understands the pshat here. Go ahead.
Because it became obvious oil.
I know what it says here. Does anyone understand the pshat of what he's saying here? Why the only way to explain that is because
Istalkus oil is because it's too much. It has to be nostalgic. But if it's of, it could be shaykhs to become a keli.
That's
Does
not
not
what I'm
have
asking. That's obvious pshat. That's not what I'm addressing. That's the whole point. I've been explaining for the last 20 minutes, that you have the teacher has to recede in order to allow the keli to emerge. That's clear. That's not the question. The question is, he's saying, Mishum zeh lo nistalik hareshim be'eshin nistalik ha'er. What's the Mishum zeh? Because of what? The oil has in it this thickness, these particles. It's not obvious. The oil then transmits, it recedes, and the Roshem remains. And that Roshem will become the keli. But it was klula kodim ba'oil. It could be means very practical. It just means simply this, that since the Roshem was in the oil before, so it's not like some new entity was created here. So even if the oil, the intensity of the light recedes, the Roshem remains, because it's all part of, the Roshem is not a new creation. It was there before. Like I said, the reason the residue remains at the bottom of a pot when you cook it, the water, when you boil the water, is because it was there. It's not no one added it. It's just that when the water was boiled, it allowed the residue to emerge. So maybe that's what he's simply saying. The Roshem remains because it was there before in the oil. That's what
I wonder, Rabbi. I wonder. I mean, this is way off. This is from left field, but it's like when Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai, his face glowed. So that's like a Roshem of the light that he was revealed to him when he was on top of Mount Sinai. The light's gone, but there's still a Roshem of the light on his face.
Yeah, that's not a question. What's that we know that. That's not a question why a light that shines and then it recedes doesn't mean it doesn't leave any effect. You see that all the time. That's why I gave the different examples. That's not what I'm trying to understand. That's a given. You bring an example, you don't need that example. It's very simple. If the sun is shining and then it goes under the clouds, it's like nothing is left. No, there's always something remains. That's very clear. It may be understood once we go further into understanding the Tzimtzum Arishin. I see it ready. We got to stop here anyway. But
can I ask a question though? When
hold
you're
on.
done?
1 minute. So the obvious is there before. It's obviously not obvious. The air leaves a Reshem, and as the air recedes, that Roshem can develop, the thickness develops further, like I explained. The student begins to understand the idea. 1 second. Okay, I'm going to stop here. We'll have to go over it anyway, but go ahead. What would you like to ask?
Well, I think he was saying this is a different Reshimu. This is a different Roshem than we previously
Of course.
had discussed. Right.
He says that's explicitly.
I
He
know.
says, Ein zeh, ein zeh.
I haven't asked my question there. Yeah.
Okay.
My
yeah.
question is, how is it different than the Reshimu we previously discussed?
We didn't
It's the
finish
same-
the sentence. We didn't. He didn't finish yet. We didn't finish. It's the second part of the paragraph that we have to still learn.
I
If you
see.
read on,
Okay.
he's going to contrast it. We didn't get there. Yet.
Okay. Cliffhanger. Are we having class tomorrow?
Why not?
Well, I
Thanksgiving.
think we should. I would think we would, but I don't know.
You
I'm all
mentioned
for
2
it.
days. You mentioned 2 days that you weren't going to be. I forgot already which ones.
2 days what?
I said 1 day this week and 1 day next week. I thought. That's what maybe.
I
Yeah,
have
I
no
thought you
reason
said
not-
you would. I thought
From my
you
end,
said there
I'm-
wasn't going to be class at some point.
Yeah, I did too. That's what I was confused.
I don't recall saying that.
Okay,
Said
good.
it.
So we're
Okay, but
Okay, it doesn't matter
see,
what I said. I don't see
Well,
any reason not.
but
I'm
We're
here.
gonna have class continuously. Then.
Oh,
Okay,
maybe.
fine.
I mean, maybe I was talking about travels that I may have, but I'm here. So let's go for it.
Yay.
Yeah, we'll have a class tomorrow. Sure.
wonderful.
Yeah. What better way to give thanks? You know.
Is there a place that we can go to look this up besides Eitz Chaim?
I would start with the Eitz Chaim. There may be other Maimonim that talk about it. There is an Ayin Beis volume 1 or 2 that the Rebbe Rashab already discussed this idea. But I have to find this exactly where. Chassidus, besides the Eitz Chaim, you're not going to find much about it unless you find it in Chassidus. The comparison between the two Reshimus, I think we learned earlier in volume 1, I think. But I have to find that. And we're in the middle of it, so I wouldn't fret. You know, we haven't even read the second half. I was just trying to understand what this Reshimu and Akudim is about. What you see clearly is that it's a very eloquent structure of how things are built. Like I said, with education, you need to have oyer to build something, but you want to make sure it's not overwhelming. It's like I said before, you don't want to suffocate the student or this child, but you want to give them. So you have to nurture them, but just enough so they can develop their own containers, so to speak. And that's the simplest example to understand this process. Now, the Reshimu after the Tzimtzum Rishon has a very different role, as we're going to learn. So we'll get there. Look, we've gotten this far. I think we have to exercise some patience. You know, you could obviously read ahead, try to figure it out by all means, and we'll get there. So I'm going to stop here by this piece. I'm going to look at us also up. I want to look it up in Eitz Chaim. We'll see what it says.
Can I
there.
ask you a question, Rabbi?
On
maybe
page
I don't- I think it's relevant.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to think about like lahavdil, like scientific, the metaphysics of whatever the physics of Big Bang, etc. And you know, when you have a Big Bang, then matter starts to
They all
congeal.
talk about residue. They all talk about
Yeah.
the residue that remains. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is this Roshem, is this basically the beginning of Gashmius? Meaning it's a congealed essence of light. And we talk about how everything is light, just different degrees of it. And we know that even Gashmias has its own.
Yeah, here, I wouldn't call it the beginning of Gashmis. I would call it the beginning of substance. Because Gashmis is a particular form of substance. You could also have Ruchnisdik substance. It's the beginning of identity is what I would say. Because remember, we're talking here on very deep spiritual levels, where Oyer is more the conveying of God's intentions, and the Keli is more the product. So you could say Reshimu is the beginning of the product. The production itself is beginning to it's the early stages of production or product, so to speak.
And I just wonder if that's the difference. Yeah, I just wonder if that's the difference between pure ore and this Roshem, this heavier congealed light.
I think you just be patient. It'll get clear.
Okay. Thank you.
Is it correct to say that Le'achri Tzimtzum Rishon, the Kav V'chut, could happen only after the Reshimu? Otherwise, there would be no place for Kav V'chut.
The Rebbe has a aura about it in Ranak, where generally speaking, you say the Kav comes from the Igul HaGadol, the Oyer. But there he says the Kav comes through the Reshimu. So there is an aspect that the Kav is affected by the Koyach HaGvul, but it's a bigger discussion. It's not a 2-minute one. That needs to be elaborated upon. Because on one hand, the Kav is Oyer. It's not, Sharshe is not from the Reshimu. It's from Oyer. It's just it's a Kav Chut now. And the Reshimu is more Koyach HaGvul. But they do interact both ways. The Reshimu affects the Kav and the Kav affects the Reshimu. But I want to reserve that. That deserves its own longer discussion, right? Not for now. Let's first finish what he says here. We can go back and elaborate on that.